Welcome, welcome, everyone. Welcome to our class, our third exam masterclass on unseen poetry. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today. We are just about to get started. Hello, Zakia. Thank you for joining us. 4 people joining. Zakia will also be helping to mod with us today. So if I miss a question, she will flag it for us as well. And if there are any technical issues, do let one of us know. Hello, IGCSE. How are you? I'm very well. Lovely to have you back. How have your exams been going the last couple of days? Let me know. Sure, it's getting quite real right now with it being fully into exam season at this point. Okay, so welcome to our exam masterclass. So this is actually our third exam masterclass out of 4 that we're providing for you as part of our offering for Key Stage 5 students to help prepare them for this exam series. So we are going to be looking today at everything poetry, and we'll be looking at, for this session, an unseen poem. So unless you have been reading my notes, that you likely have not seen before, a contemporary poem, so that we can engage with some of the ideas of poetry without having to dive into the specifications of one particular exam board or limit ourselves to one of those exam boards. However, we will be addressing what the expectations look like across A-level poetry as well. You could also consider this a deep dive into poetry more broadly, as we're going to be looking at devices, at assessment objectives, at effects, at essay planning, about how to analyze a poem, how to think about writing about a poem, and how to formulate this into an essay that is achievable within the confines of an A-level exam paper, whilst also thinking about more common questions that come up with A-level and even for GCSE as well. Ideas like, how can you write about an unseen poem? How can you do this for context, for example? How can you write about a writer's intention? Hello, SH. This is covering all exam boards. So all of the different exam boards have poetry, and this will be able to support you with their study. It's also helpful, even if you're thinking about GCSE, though this would be for aiming for the highest parts of the mark scheme for GCSE. But this is really poetry more broadly than just one exam board, but we will be talking about the expectations for all. Okay, so as we get started, take a look in the description if you haven't already. Some of you who are returning to us or who are veterans of the exam masterclass series, you will see that there is a link in the description of this video to the workbook for today's session. So in that, I've made a workbook for you so that you don't have to copy everything I'm writing or everything I'm saying or presenting on these slides, and you have a version that you can annotate, write your notes on, and then use to revise as you need. So you can leave this session with a full stack of notes that you can then use as you need to, depending on where you are in your academic journey. So let's get started, shall we? So if this is your first time joining us, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the English teachers at My EdSpace, and My EdSpace is offering free streams for GCSE and A-level students during the exam season and across the year in order to help support you in your study. So I'm Eleanor, and I have been providing these live streams for people. Some of you have joined us before, And if this is your first time joining us, do feel free to take a look at my page, because I have covered a whole series on Othello, on A Streetcar Named Desire, on The Great Gatsby, on The Handmaid's Tale, which we are still doing every week on Wednesdays from 6:50 to 8:20 here on YouTube. And then in June, we're also going to be doing more poetry in our Wednesday lessons, as well as in our final exam masterclass in 2 weeks' time, same time from 3 to 6 on the 29th of May. So let's start with a big question to see who's in the room, what we know about poetry, and really to get your minds back to the basics of poetry, and to uncover what it is that you know about poetry as a form. So put into the chat, what do you know about poetry here? What do you know about poetry? Well, firstly, it's a kind of literature, isn't it? That is distinct from prose and drama. Drama being, of course, plays, and prose often being defined as anything that's not poetry. With poetry as well, we think of people like Shakespeare, perhaps like Milton with Paradise Lost, like Keats, like Rossetti, like Tennyson, like Shelley, and more broadly the Romantics. Perhaps as well like Donne and the metaphysical poets. Rossetti, Tennyson, Romantics, Donne are the most common poems and people studied at A level across different exam boards. So those names might ring bells, or they might ring bells from GCSE as well, or just more broadly from society. We can also think about poetry as known very well for its structure, right? It's very long and skinny on the page. It's not paragraphs, but rather stanzas. And organized not into sentences, but into lines. And there are lots of other words that are linked to poetry as well. Words like sonnets, couplets, like haikus, like dramatic monologues, that all speak to the different kinds of poetry. Apologies, I'm just going to write dramatic sonnet. That speak to the different kinds of poetry that we might encounter, or the different formulae that we might find to help organize a poem. We can also think about poetry as often linked with, that's monologue there, linked with emotions, right? As a form of personal expression, engagement with emotions. Often a kind of reflection or meditation. For example, we might think of Ode to a Grecian Urn with Keats, thinking about literally sitting there looking at a vase from ancient Greece and thinking about what it means and what thoughts it provokes. So Ode on a Grecian Urn might be one you know as well. Even ones like Ozymandias, again, hearing a story from someone describing two legs in a desert, two statue legs, that is, in a desert, thinking about all of the feelings that an image like that provokes. With that as well, with poetry then, we're thinking about images, or what's focused on in a poem. What are we looking at? And how are we experiencing it? Is it being used as a symbol? Is it being used as a focal point? Are we looking at it in different ways? Is it representing certain ideas? We can also think about poetic devices like, famously, rhyme. Roses are red, violets are blue. We're looking at it, Adia, exactly. At the Grecian urn, are you thinking in particular, or the legs of Ozymandias? Perhaps? Yes, we're also thinking of words like caesura, enjambment, meter, end stops, onomatopoeia, assonance, consonants. So here thinking about the sounds and movement of a poem. And even in that movement, the breath work, right? How we're breathing as we're reading, and thus what words are important or how we are feeling here. We can also think about what poetry is often used for. Most typically, with that roses are red, violets are blue, we're thinking about ideas of love. But typically as well, poetry historically has most commonly been used for love as well as spirituality or devotion. So thinking about, in a way, two sides of the same coin. So either the ideas of love for a person or an idea, or love for a god or a religious object or an experience. And then we can also think about the kind of negatives about poetry, right? People think it's hard to understand. People think about it as complicated. People think of it as difficult to understand the references, as maybe about something too complex to grasp. Thinking about tension and frustration with poems as you try and work out what's right and what's wrong. And some people even feel that they have barred entry to poetry because there are really tricky references or bits to it that you might not pick up on if you haven't been exposed to a wealth of different kinds of literature. And that speaks to different levels of access, as well as how important it is to have an education, of course, is being able to pick up on these little ideas that then can unlock much more meaning. So if you are reticent about poetry, so if you're worried about poetry and its rules and its complexity and the fact that it doesn't give you a right answer, then don't worry, because it is in embracing those difficult parts there and providing your own personal engagement with it. So trying to work out your reaction to it and why you think that's the case actually brings us to what is important about poetry, is personal response as a result of the way the writer is trying to create meaning through the choices that they are making. And in embracing ambiguity, embracing the difficult parts there, you are attempting to tackle a form, poetry, that is often complex. And thus you can show many more skills of writing and analysis because it's not straightforward. And so it's not a tired kind of robotic response to a very one-dimensional issue, but you have the opportunity to be imaginative and creative and respond to what stands out to you. When we talk about poetry, gut is important, your gut reaction to things and why they stand out to you. So let's take a look at what poetry even looks like at A level. So across the different exam boards, there is representation for poetry because it is expected that as part of your study, higher study of literature, that you are engaging with perhaps the oldest form of literature, which is poetry. And for example, for AQA, poetry appears in paper 1, section B, in the unseen poetry comparison. So then notice that you are not only engaging with one unseen poem, but two here. And this is a closed part of the paper, which means that you don't have all of your other books and notes about. You need to respond to something you've never seen before and make sense of it in writing. The same for paper 1, section C. This is one of your set texts of poetry. So a poem that you have studied, or a text of poetry, like an anthology that you have studied, and comparing this to a set prose text. So here, engaging with different forms of writing, prose versus poetry, and engaging with how, particularly the form of poetry versus the form of prose, these two different mediums are used perhaps to illustrate similar points or to engage in the same topic. That is open book there. And poetry also appears for AQA on paper 2 in sections A and B, depending on which options you choose. So for option 1, and double check with your teacher, because it will depend which option you're talking about, what poetry will look like for you. But it will, for option 1, be your poetry set text comparative question, which means that you are comparing poems from the same anthology with a theme in mind. And then for options 2 and 3, you are looking at a poetry set text comparative question to another set drama or prose text. So thinking about, again, that tension between different forms and mediums there. And that is also open book, that part. Poetry anthologies can also be used for coursework. So rather than using 2 novels, you're looking at a collection of poems, and you'd be looking at more than one poem, but multiple poems in a collection to engage with your idea in your extended piece of coursework. For Edexcel, your poetry is contained to paper 3. So in Edexcel, your first paper is drama, your second paper is prose, and your third paper is poetry. So you are not comparing different types of writing, but you are comparing poems. In section A for Edexcel, you are doing a comparative question choice. So you have a choice in your options there on a Poems of the Decade, which is the anthology of contemporary poetry that you study for Edexcel, and an unseen poem. So you're given an unseen poem and you're given a comparative there. And you have a choice between 2 different themes with 2 different seen or studied poems to compare to. So History by John Burnside and Memory, or Out of the Bag and Family Bonds, for example. And then for section B, you have a set poetry anthology. So this is where your perhaps Rossetti, your Tennyson, your Romantics, your Victorians, your whoever your set anthology is. And again, this will depend school by school. And so it's either an era or a specific poet who you're studying various different poems of. Both of these, you have fresh copies of the text, but both of them as well are comparisons. So notice you'll need to, in that hour and 7 minutes or slightly more if you have extra time, thinking about being able to say quite a lot about 2 different poems and link them to a theme, including perhaps poems that you have never seen before and thus perhaps need a bit more time to look at. Then for OCR, poetry appears in component 1, your drama and poetry pre-1900. This is comparison between drama and poetry. Again, typically the texts used for poetry are Keats, Tennyson and Rossetti, though again check with your school. And this one is closed text, so you don't have all of your notes and poems with you. You're expected to respond to it without. And of course, again, you can do and choose one of your texts as a poetry anthology there. Any questions, feel free to take a look, to pop them into the chat. and we'll be happy to answer them to spend more time on them. But as you can see, this breaks down into quite a lot of poetry across the different examples. So regardless of where you slot into these, or if you're just thinking about future study or using this to revise, though you know your exam specification, just a reminder of what you're actually expected to do here. And let's take a look now at the poetic devices that most typically come up. Now, of course, if you're scanning this and you say, well, Miss, what about zoomorphism, for example? Sure, there are other devices out there that can appear in poems, but these are the ones that typically get the most coverage, appear the most frequently, and can get the most mileage out of if you're thinking of analysis. As you can see, I've given you both the definitions and the devices themselves. So these can be used to turn into flashcards, whether they're flashcards or note cards, some kind of revision material by hand, or putting these into, for example, a Quizlet so that you can practice learning these vocabulary terms. You don't, of course, need to know every single poetic device that exists, but these are my guidance towards which ones are important. So let's run through these, and any that stand out to you, need more explanation, please do pop into the chat to let us know. So first, thinking about structure, caesura is stops in the middle of the line, coming from the word literally to seize or to stop. So that pause in the middle of a line. Traditionally in poetry, punctuation only happens at the end of the line. So any punctuation in the middle of a line of poetry is an interruption because it indicates a breath or a shift or even just a moment of pause, which guides you to want to think about, okay, what's happening here? Is this an interruption or a shift in thought or perspective? Is this highlighting one of these words? Is this a breaking off of an idea? So you want to take a look at the words around a caesura, as well as the tone and focus of the words around the caesura, and think, okay, why are we stopping here? Why are we taking this extra moment for effect here? The same for enjambment. The opposite of caesura. Enjambment is when you carry on lines without punctuation onto the next line. The way that I remember this is a silly little mind image, but the jam in a sandwich, if you squish the sandwich too hard, the jam runs over the edges of the bread, just like the line of poetry runs over the edge onto the next. It's like it's trickling over there. Again, you want to think about why this might be. Poets set out knowing that punctuation happens at the end of a line. So if they don't have it at the end of the line, we need to think about why. Is it because they're trying to have this kind of casual attitude and voice that sounds quite colloquial and familiar? Is it because they're racing and excited? Is it because they're building tension? Is it because they are reaching out across, both metaphorically and linguistically, grammatically, across the line to the next one? There are those moments of connection. Do think about the importance of line length. Why are we stopping here, and why are we then carrying on to the next part of the line there? Is it to point out these specific words? Again, with enjambment, notice where the line ends and where it carries on. Does that create a new sense of meaning? With these as well, it's interesting to think about when the rules are followed. So with end stops, that is the punctuation at the end of a line. For example, the difference between a poem in its final line having a piece of punctuation at the end versus not, perhaps is the difference between a sense of finality or acceptance at the end of a poem versus continuity and a lack of resolution. Those tiny little details mean a lot in poetry where every single moment is intentional. With that as well, we want to think about the structure of the poem. Thinking about literally visually on the page, can we notice anything here? Of course, most poems look a little bit like little columns, but if it's a poem, for example, about a tower, or if you do Edexcel from the Journal of a Disappointed Man, thinking about it as the pier itself, the shape of the pier. Or if the poem is jagged, then we want to think about why that might be. A poet could easily format their poem or reorganize it so that it's very neat and structured. If it's very neat and structured, is that a show of control and rigidity? If it's more jagged, is that a sense of dislocation or disruption or looseness or movement across the poem? And if it's perhaps replicating even an image from the poem or drawing notice through white space, perhaps through a stanza enjambment, so reaching a sentence across, then having a break for a stanza and continuing it on after the white space, again, thinks of that space of reaching over, hanging over, extension, connection there. Then we're thinking more about sounds with alliteration there. Alliteration is the repeated first letters or sounds there. So hearing the same sound. It's one thing to say that you hear it. It's another thing and a much more important idea to consider why that sound. So for example, if this is a poem about autumn and we're hearing a lot of sh, 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 or sounds, could that be attempting to replicate the sound of the leaves? Is it very buzzy or very full of plosives, which are those kind of spitty letters? And if so, is that creating a sense of harshness or frustration or desire? Have a think about that as well. Because alliteration is really a form of repetition, an image, a word, an idea that returns. And with repetition, we're thinking about emphasis. So any time that we have repeated ideas or repeated sounds, whether through rhyme or through alliteration or consonants, assonance, sibilants, those are here, then we're thinking about the emphasis of a certain sound and repeating of that sound for effect. Your job is to work out what is that effect. We can also think about ideas that appear in other texts. So imagery, to create detailed description, light and darkness there as well, bringing out positive or negative views or a focal point for us that we notice certain ideas. Of course, the title is also important. It will give you key details and foreground important ideas. For unseen poems, it is very common for the examiners to choose a poem that the title gives you some idea about the poem as well, because of course they are sympathetic to the idea that you've not seen this poem before, and perhaps that might be helpful to you. Even if it's, for example, a sonnet and it tells you sonnet 19, for example, that gives you a reminder of the fact that sonnets are meant to be about love and devotion, and sonnets are meant to be 14 lines. And there are rules about sonnets, and that will already locate us into the ideas of poetry and the poem. So we've got imagery, of course, description. If you're struggling to remember imagery or a particular kind of imagery like biblical imagery, religious imagery, natural imagery, thinking about sensory imagery, then you can just use imagery. It's helpful to be more specific, but you don't have to be. And if you can't remember imagery in a moment of panic, you can also just use detailed description. That counts as a literary device. It's not about the fancy words you use. It's much more about talking about their effect. What is the effect of focusing on this image? Why are we getting so much detail about it? As I said, the same goes for light and darkness, the title. With poetry as well, we want to think about first and last lines, because they will either show the distance we've traveled in a poem or return to these ideas again, perhaps in a new way. So they will give an indication of the first thought, the first presentation versus the last presentation, and how we conclude, or if we conclude in a poem, or if we return to these same ideas, perhaps in reflection or an endless cycle of something. As I said, the structure of the poem. So think about the lines. If we suddenly break our pattern of lines and stanzas, what does that mean to us? Because it is definitely important. if we're using a sonnet structure, and it's always helpful if you're close to a sonnet structure, for example, if it's a 13-line poem, perhaps then it might be a truncated sonnet, which means it's a sonnet that's not been completed. And we might want to think, well, in intentionally crafting this so it's very like a sonnet, but taking away one essential element, are we trying to play with the ideas of a sonnet, or the lack of conclusion of a sonnet? The idea is ongoing then. The same for 15 lines as well, thinking about adding on to a sonnet. Perhaps that's an effusion, very common in Rossetti. With rhyme as well, as I said, rhyme is a kind of repetition. So words that sound similar, usually at the end of lines, they may be internal rhyme as well. So words that rhyme within the line, that would be particularly noticeable and might be an attempt to create a sense of harmony or to draw attention to certain words, to hear them over and over again, like an echo across the line that perhaps shows the significance or resonance or continuation of that idea. Then meter, the rhythm, not always appearing and certainly less common in contemporary poems. So much less common in poems that are written today, because it's much more common to find poems in free verse now. So without as much rhyme, without as much meter. The most common is iambic, whether that's iambic trimeter, iambic pentameter, just depends on how many iambs or how many dedums there are in a line. It is noticeable if it's there, right? And it's also noticeable if it changes all of a sudden. The same goes for rhyme. If we're very, very rhymey and then we stop, why might that be the case? Or if we're not very rhymey or not very patterned or rhythmic, and then we suddenly get quite patterned or rhythmic or rhyming, why is that again? Similarly, for tense, this often shifts, particularly around a volta of a sonnet, for example, or in a dramatic monologue that is thinking about the relationship with the implied listener as well. Then it's important to think about these shifts. Are we shifting towards the future? Are we reflecting on the past? Are we now in this very moment, as we are in Barrett Browning? Rhetorical questions, onomatopoeia, symbols are all ideas like tense, like light and darkness, like imagery that you'll have found in other texts. Rhetorical questions, of course, suggest an answer there. If they answer themselves, then they're hypophora. Again, the distinction is less important than telling us why are they asking us right now. Onomatopoeia, the sounds, particularly creating a physicality here, right? By trying to make it sound like what they describe. So making it more present, more noticeable, more real. The symbol as well, very common in poems. You can think about particularly light, nature, hands as symbolic. Any object really likely has symbolic resonance in a poem. Anaphora and epiphora here linked together. Anaphora and epiphora are types of repetition. Anaphora, A, at the beginning of lines, much like A is at the beginning of the alphabet, and epiphora, end. So repetition at the ends of lines. Again, if that works for you to help you remember which one is which, that's absolutely fine. If you can't remember it, just say repetition and talk about what is being emphasized through that repetition. We've got as well strong verbs, important in poems that don't require the same kind of narrative as a piece of prose or drama. So thinking then about why we are moving, or what is this urgency here. Collective pronouns, either creating a sense of inclusivity and collectiveness, or distance, so the difference between we and us versus they. Juxtaposition, a very, very common one for poems as well. Two opposites, and what's the effect? To highlight their differences. So to show the differences between light and dark, good and bad, happiness and grief, for example, juxtaposition is extremely common. If you have two opposite ideas or two images in a poem, consider whether they are juxtaposed, whether they are shown to be different, because likely they are. As I said, sibilance, repetition of S sounds. It can be calming, like a soothing whisper, or it can be ominous, like a hissing. Consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds. It's often not as pleasing to the ear. It can be gentle consonants, for example, with H's, perhaps with P's, with F's are slightly more fricative, so slightly less pleasant, but they often sound noisy, chaotic, or unharmonious and may create cacophony, which is a sense of unpleasant noise here across the poem. That's an effect, is cacophony. And assonance, the opposite, repetition of vowel sounds, often sounds pleasant, light, and melodious. It's really engaging with the voice of vowels in a poem, the resonance of vowels in a poem, and may create euphony, the opposite, a really pleasant, positive, harmonious effect to the ear, like music almost, whereas cacophony would be like noise. Of course, as well, we've got tone. If we're struggling with where to start for poems, consider what the tone is, or think about when you're trying to establish an effect, the effect of repetition, is it creating an urgent tone, an inspired tone, a devoted tone, a nostalgic tone, right? Because that will help to achieve some of the effect of talking about your other ideas as well. A volta is a very specific word, but often one I notice is either unnoticed when it's important in a sonnet, for example, or misused when we're thinking about poems that are not sonnets. So a volta is very specifically a turn in an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet in which the subject, attitude, or perspective shifts, typically after the 8th line. If it's not, that's on purpose. It might be early, like in I Think of Thee, which is a very common GCSE poem, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, because it's suggesting the excitement, the ideas of not being able to wait, or it's delayed, as if we're not able to let something go. When we're talking about shifts in poems, otherwise, we can just say the word shift, the shift in perspective, the shift in voice, the shift in rhyme, in tense, in tone is important there to make that distinction, because it just suggests that you don't know the words that you're using there. But it's important, if we suddenly are moving into present or future tense, to acknowledge that, hey, maybe we're looking at something else now. This could be a new perspective, a new attitude. Simile and metaphor, you likely know, using to compare different ideas. Again, very common in poetry, to create a clearer picture, to bring notice to a specific idea. Hello, Manaz. Thank you for joining us again. Pathetic fallacy, setting or the weather matching the character or mood. Very common when we've got natural imagery as well, that it's building this idea of matching the mood of the poem or a character in the poem, the emotions of a poem there. The perspective is the point of view told from. Important, the difference between a personal I perspective, a first person perspective, versus you or they, creates a sense more of distance there. Also important if that shifts across the poem. Diacope is just a fancy word for close repetition, particularly when words are repeated within the same line. Just a way to flex a little bit different knowledge of repetition as well. I've repeated metaphor and simile here, so I don't need to return to those. Apologies for that. But the other is an allusion, so a reference, an implicit or passing reference to another text, person, place, or idea. Most commonly, these are biblical allusions, so thinking about Jesus, thinking about different religious ideas, for example, of the East and West, the sun, the idea of bread and wine, etc. The water of life, the Garden of Eden is very common as well. or even snakes and serpents as biblical allusions to Satan. Feel free again to put any ideas into the chat, any questions you have, anything you'd like clarified on what we've covered so far. Now let's take a look at tone. So I said tone is important here. And you're absolutely true. I'm absolutely correct. It is. Here are some words that are approaching towards that more A-level language of writing about tone. If you have a panic in the exam, start with positive or negative, and then see if you can try and winnow your way down from that. Is this, for example, condemning, or is this just slightly critical? Is this joyful, or is it more light-hearted? Is it playful, or is it sarcastic? So it's helpful to think about the different levels of nuance to this. What I suggest to my A-level students is to have some positive and negative tone words locked and loaded for yourself with varied intensities. So having some more harsh and heavy words for negative, and then having some lighter or more subtle ones. And the same for positive as well, having more subtly positive and then some more enthusiastically positive ones here. And I've provided a whole bunch, so I'm going to read them out and just think about, can you borrow any of these to try in your next piece of writing? Notice as well, there are quite a few that are also relatively neutral. That is helpful as well to think about how we can get mileage if we're not entirely sure whilst looking at an unseen poem about the tone consistently. If we want to make a word extend past just one positive or one negative application. So I'm going to read them. If you don't know any of these, feel free to look them up or ask here as well. So reflective, pensive, joyful, mocking, mournful, enthusiastic, apprehensive, conversational, acerbic, witty, familiar, optimistic, hopeful, critical, ironic, playful, nostalgic, ambivalent, questioning, straightforward, fervent, light-hearted, resigned, elegiac, pessimistic, fearful, thoughtful, condescending, giddy, sardonic, caustic, detached, equivocal, assertive, ardent, bitter, concerned, defiant, wistful. So there's a load there to think about the complexities of not everything is positive, not everything is negative only. There are levels to that positivity and negativity, and apprehensive is very different from bitter or caustic. Those are much harsher words for a slightly negative idea there. So be mindful and think about how you can borrow some of these words. And if you don't typically talk about tone, start trying to implement that into your analysis. It's particularly helpful to think about it at the beginning of the poem, if it shifts in the middle of the poem, and then consider at the end of the poem. And some words, particularly for the end of the poem, that are helpful: resolved, resigned, resigned, enthusiastic, accepting, reflective, pessimistic, wistful, defiant, hopeful, or hopeless. That's the opposite as well. Despairing, also another one to think about, the opposite of hopeful there. So do challenge yourself to include tone, because it does get you quite far, and it does not rely on you to use a literary device, because it is in itself a literary device. So you can just choose words that create that sense of hope in a final stanza, or create that sense of questioning or uncertainty in the middle of a poem, and that can help can give you quite a lot to speak about as you analyze that tone through those word choices and explain why they might be ambivalent, assertive, mournful at this moment, and what we can expect going forwards. Now, this is a question that often year 12, year 13s raise their hands to me and say, Miss, why would examiners want to assess you on unseen poetry? Why don't they assess you merely on seen poetry? And most broadly, it's because they want to see what you can do with what you have learned. So there are so many different ways to be successful on an anthology poem. Because you've studied it, the A-level course is 2 years long. So you are spending your time studying these texts, poetry, drama, and prose for 2 years. So it's all well and good to know quite a lot about very specific ideas or to have learned ideas off by heart. But it's much more telling about what a student can do if you can see the application of those knowledge, of those skills and that knowledge in a new format, because it gives you a fresh face to look at a new opportunity and to see what you can do with a new piece of writing, or if this has just all been information you've learnt by rote for your other texts. And the unseen poetry is much more commonly the idea of what you'll be thinking about when you start thinking about higher education. So if you're thinking about English at university, or you're thinking about interviews for university as well, for Oxbridge, they typically give you an unseen poem or a poem more broadly and ask you questions about it, and you haven't seen that poem before. And so it's helpful to have those skills of being able to do something and demonstrate your knowledge with something new and fresh that allows you to apply what you have learned. So these are a bunch of bullet points to answer this question. Through an engagement with unseen poetry, you can demonstrate your knowledge of the poetic form and conventions of the poetic tradition. So show what you know about poetry and poetic traditions. You can apply your extensive knowledge of poetry from studying your poetry set texts in a new format. Particularly in those comparison texts, you can say and show your knowledge of your seen poem and also draw out comparisons to a new idea as well. You can demonstrate your knowledge of poetic terminology and its effects. You can evaluate different poets' styles, voices, perspectives, and usage of language to create effect. So looking at how these choices are made and why they are made, what meaning they create. You can engage with universal themes that allow room for the crafting of individual arguments rooted in a short piece. Hello, Dihiri. Thank you for joining us. We started at 3, but you can always watch from the beginning, or you can join us now and then rewatch as you like. So this means that you're able to look at and create arguments about an unseen text that gives you the space that is narrow enough, a single poem or a comparison with something that you already know, to show that you can create arguments and be creative with themes. It also allows you to evaluate what you know and notice about how meanings are shaped across a text. So what stands out to you in an unseen poem that you haven't been reading over and over and over again for 2 years? It also allows you to make inferences and conclusions based on the information you have in front of you, educated conclusions and inferences based on your knowledge of poetry. It allows you to formulate a response to a poet's work using analytical, critical, and writing skills. It demonstrates your ability to engage with a writer's work and to evaluate its effect and success. So, is this effective? Are these choices effective? Do they create meaning well for us? It also allows you to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of nuance in interpretation and analysis, because you don't have the chance to look up everything that's ever been written about this poem. You just have to respond to it yourself, and you have to tackle the parts that you may not fully understand, and thus show that you can handle that two things can exist at the same time, two different interpretations, and present them both. That's good. You don't have right answers in poetry. I can't say that enough. It's just how you argue it. It also shows you your ability to choose significant elements, or the significance of elements of the text, to discuss and engage in a sustained way. So to be able to talk at length about choices in a poem, and to be able to point to them and say, I know that this is important. Here's why. It allows you to reflect on the importance or significance of contextual factors. So in this case, thinking both about unseen contemporary poems as well as unseen era appropriate poems as well. So you can respond to different elements of context, even if that is just talking more broadly about society, as we will see how to do that. It allows you to acknowledge the writer's intention in their poetic choices and be able to promote a hypothesis or a conclusion about what the writer might be doing here. It might allow you to distinguish between responses from different audiences based on contextual factors. So the difference between a Rossetti poem and a contemporary poem, for example, or a poem written in the 1950s and a poem written in 2020 will be very different. It allows you to engage, as I said, with ambiguity and acknowledge various interpretations. It allows you to forge and analyze connections between different texts ranging across the literary canon. So connections between different poems from different time periods, different places. And select appropriate places for comparison. So here we're not comparing apples and oranges, we're comparing apples and apples. So we're trying to find through lines or threads between these two poems in how they talk about a topic. And then allows an opportunity for you to read and engage with poetry beyond your anthology text. And the examiners and the exam boards offer this as an exciting thing, that you can be exposed to new and more exciting poetry because you clearly are lovers of literature. If you have been in one of our exam masterclasses before, this may seem a little bit familiar to you. I'll move myself out of the way. And because we're looking at the assessment objectives across different exam boards as well. Assessment objectives are what you are being marked on for each exam board. So for AQA, we're looking at comparison here in particular. And for AQA, the same assessment objectives are used across all of the different questions, all of the different papers for the exam. But the examiners note that for paper 1, section A, AO2, which is analyze ways in which meanings are shaped in literary texts, is the dominant assessment objective. It's the one that is carrying the most weight for section A, and then for section 1, and then for section 2, AO3 and AO5 are the dominant assessment objectives. So this means exploring the text informed by different interpretations and demonstrating the value of context and thinking about literary critical concepts and terminology, mature, impressive expression, sophisticated argument, understanding of authorial methods, assuredness in the connection between different texts and different time periods, perceptive exploration of connections across the text, and perceptive and confident engagement with the debate. That's what you need to achieve in order to get into band 5, which is perceptive and assured response. So that's the top band for an AQA response. And then for Edexcel, to achieve level 5, you need to be critical and evaluative. And you're assessed not on AO5 for your poetry paper, but rather on AO1 and AO2 chiefly. And then for section A, which is the unseen comparison with the unseen poem comparison with the Poems of the Decade anthology poem, you're looking at AO4 as well, in which you're being assessed on your comparison. So your ability to evaluate connections between texts in a fully integrated approach. So an approach that actually links these two texts together in a clear, consistent way and makes links between them that make sense. And then for the section B, which is the 2 anthology poems with choice of which ones you compare, you need to focus more on what you know, because for AO3, you're assessed on the significance and influence of context. So for example, if you're writing about the Romantics, the Victorians, Rossetti, Tennyson, then you need to think about the context that influences these poems, both the writer's personal context, as well as perhaps the movement they're a part of, as well as other social and political context that may apply. Notice though, across the different texts, this idea of how meanings are shaped stands out here as crucial, because this is really key to your analysis of poetry, is noticing what the writer is doing and what meaning is being created as a result. What can you say about the choices they're making? What effect is it having on you? With poetry, this is particularly important because with poetry, all is intentional, and there has to be nuance and consideration for how meanings are shaped in texts for poetry, because both devices and the absence of devices, so for example, the absence of a rhyme scheme or a sudden change away from a structure, also is indicative of meaning and creates meaning for us. So something very important to consider. For level 5 of Edexcel, again, you are trying to be critical and evaluative. So building your argument that is critical and evaluating how a theme is presented, using sustained textual examples, so peppering them in as patterns and analyzing them fully with that evaluation of the way meanings are shaped in text. A sophisticated understanding of the writer's craft, so understanding what the writer is doing and why. Thinking about the evaluation and appreciation of significance and influence of context for your scene poems for section 2, and then your connections in a fully integrated approach in section 1. Again, any questions, feel free to pop into the chat. And let's take a look here at what the examiners want to see in the exam, because oftentimes students feel unconfident in what the writers of the exam actually want you to do. So let's take a look. This information is all coming from the examiner's reports taken from across different exam boards. So I have read through the different exam reports from previous years' writing, particularly more recent ones. And what is an examiner's report? An examiner's report is literally the exam board publishing a report to teachers in particular about the trends they notice in writing and in the questions after an exam series. So looking at how many students, across all of the students who've taken that exam, how many responded to different questions, how easy or difficult students found it, and any trends in what students are doing that are either really good or that need to be addressed by teachers thinking about going forwards in teaching. And what common pitfalls or what common problems the examiners are finding as they're marking hundreds and thousands of papers. So this is what stands out to the examiners, that there's a tendency for students to spend an unequal amount of time on the questions, leading to the second section being incomplete. So for these different exams, they have completely different timings, but they are all given on papers in which you have multiple responses you have to do. And it's typically just over an hour per response. And it is very, very common, particularly for students new to exams. So for example, for year 12s doing their mocks, to spend too much time on the first question and then only have time for a page or a page and a half of analysis for the other question. And this is a real shame because it means that students don't have the opportunity to score highly on that second part at all. So you do have to both practice your analysis so that it is fit for purpose and effective, but also that your writing and analysis and planning is at a speed that is doable for your exam, because this is different from writing a doctoral dissertation about a poem in which you can spend years writing about the poem. We can all do that and come up with a perfect essay at some point. What's more difficult is being able to do that in an hour with a poem you haven't seen before. So you do have to be mindful of timing in order to do well on this exam, which means you do need to know your stuff before going in. It's also important examiners keep indicating about handwriting. So many students go through the 2 years of A-level study, typing all of their essays, and then have to sit down to an exam that's handwritten, and they cannot type and write at the same speed. So it is important, I would say, every essay you're writing as an A-level student, unless directed otherwise by your teacher, ought to be handwritten so that you can practice the speed of your handwriting and working. And also that paragraphing is important. So sometimes people get really nervous and worried and carried away with analysis, and it leads to them writing and writing and writing and writing. And then you look at the exam itself and there are 5 pages that are all one paragraph altogether, which makes it seem less like well-structured intentional paragraphs and more like a rant or a stream of consciousness. And examiners say that this leads to limited coherence and difficulty for examiners. It just is basically that you are putting every single thing you know about this poem onto a page, and that doesn't mean that it makes sense. You need to organize yourself, and that's why planning is important as well. Examiners literally say, think more, write less, and spend more time planning. It is much better to write 3 paragraphs that are of a high quality than write 5 paragraphs and have them be incoherent or very sparse on analysis. Your most amount of time needs to be spent on analysis here. You need to take a focused approach to argument crafting. So that means you can't just talk about the poem in general for an hour and a bit. You need to select specific ideas from the poem to focus on and track how they change across the poem. Hello, Maeve. Thank you for joining us. Lovely to have you here. You also need to consider that critical and personally engaging with the poems is important. Oftentimes, students get so worried trying to remember everything about the poems that they don't actually say a huge amount about them. As I said, they just vomit everything they know about a poem onto a page and don't actually engage with what the poem means. You need to actually have that moment of creative thought to think about what the poem is saying and your response as a legitimate part of the audience to that poem. It's also important to consider that comparing themes and ideas across the poems is better than a ready-made structure. Otherwise, nuance is lost. So some of your teachers sometimes, or you yourself, will think, okay, well, I'll just learn off this exam structure and then I'll be able to do it whatever. Or I'll just memorize these lines of arguments for the poem, or memorize only these few poems, and then regardless, I'll write about those ones. That's actually not very good, because it just means that you're trying to force the exam question and the essay you should write into a structure that doesn't fit it. And if anyone's tried on shoes that don't fit them, that are too small, they'll understand the feeling of what an examiner feels when they read an essay that's clearly been structured beforehand, because it just often doesn't make sense and very much is not natural, which means you are automatically barring yourself from the highest parts of the mark scheme, where you are creating a thoughtful and responsive argument that is responsive to the material you have now and can't prepare beforehand. Analysis at word level, so GCSE level analysis, where you spend time talking about the connotations of one word and then you move on, is not helpful for A level. You need to think about the words in response and in the context of the poem or the line more broadly. Because if you don't, it just sounds like you're talking about this one word and you're not connecting it to anything else in the poem. You need to link it to other parts of the poem, even if that's just showing that later the focus changes from sunrise to sunset, for example. Don't spend all your time talking about the sun and neglect to acknowledge that that sun disappears or changes across the poem. This can even lead to misreadings, as they said. So taking something so out of context that you're actually not analyzing it correctly. Whereas if you consider it within the line, within the poem, you'll be able to understand it better. It's important to focus on an unseen poem and use it to pull comparisons with a studied poem. This leads to fresh analysis. So again, don't try and jam this unseen poem into what you want to talk about with this studied poem. Instead, think, what connections can we draw from here at the beginning? Where do they both start? Where do they both go? And how do they both conclude? Is there a resolution on this shared theme they have? Think about how the theme is presented rather than just the parts that you want to talk about in your studied poem. The examiners say there's a need for candidates to explain clearly why these techniques are significant and how they shape meaning. So you need to say, okay, if there is a symbol, if there's consonance or assonance or repetition, why is that the case? What meaning is being created there? You need to avoid analyzing specific features of structure and language in isolation, and feature spotting, which is when you say, hey, I noticed there's rhyme here. I'm going to tell you about rhyme. And then not actually tell us anything about rhyme because you're too busy telling us that there is rhyme. It matters much more what you say about the rhyme than identifying. And this is where people get into very fancy poetic devices and choose, for example, to talk about epiphora and anaphora rather than just repetition, because they want to use the word epiphora, but then they don't actually tell us why it's important that each of these lines starts the same way, or the repetition of these beginnings is important, why those words in particular. That's called feature spotting, just pointing to a device and saying, hey, I noticed this. It's there. Quote, move on. No. Quote and move on is the introduction. A quote there is the introduction to talking about the idea. Relate it instead to the writer's choices, to the themes, messages, or impacts of the poem. Contextual factors should be analysed in the context of the poem. So the Romantic era, the Victorian era are long and different based on which poem you're talking about, what year you're talking about. You don't want to shoehorn in something about the Industrial Revolution if it doesn't apply. Only choose, and you can practice doing this with studied poems, if you're given a certain theme, or if you want to talk about a certain idea, what context would actually apply to that paragraph. That ensures that your context is actually linked to what you're saying rather than just shoved in at the end or tacked on, as they also describe it. Examiners said better responses looked at the theme, message, and impact of a poem rather than analysing purely at word level. So again, thinking about how these themes are presented in different moments of the poem. And that the best students had confidence in embracing moments of ambiguity, be willing to embrace ambiguity and be tentative. This is particularly likely to be particularly helpful for the unseen poem, as you'll have already engaged several times with the anthology poem named in the question. So it's good if you're not entirely sure what a poem is saying, because that just means you can say the different options and you get credit for nuance there. And then finally, treating critical views and context as organic. So again, that's if we're talking about natural imagery and we're comparing this to a romantic poem, perhaps then it's suitable to talk about the transcendental experiences of nature, but it's not necessarily appropriate to talk about that at any point in a poem if it doesn't apply. So these are what the questions look like. Okay. Explore how the poet uses methods to discuss the idea of history here. You're given a blank copy of a poem and a theme. What is this question asking of you? Feel free to put in the chat as well. Put in the chat as well. What is this question asking you to do? I can see some people typing. That's great. It is asking you to talk about how history is discussed using methods in this poem here. So we're talking about history presented as here. And you don't even need to read the poem right now. You could just think about what are they asking you to do regardless on a question like this. Thinking about how the poem engages with this theme and what methods they use to create meaning about this theme. Of course, this is an unseen poem, and it also tells you to explore, which means that we're going to be thinking about different ideas here for how this theme is presented and how the writer does this, and if they have different opinions or different ideas about history, or if they tackle it in different ways. Okay? This is what it is asking of you. So let's consider then, what ideas does society have about history? Again, pop into the chat. What ideas do we have about history here? What ideas do we have about history? Maeve, feel free to join us as well. Love it. Always appreciate your contributions. Okay, well, let's think about history. What is history? History is linked to the past, and it's linked to memory as well. The past, what is remembered, what's recorded, time passing here. And then with memory, what is remembered? here. And even who is remembered and why as well. We can think about ideas of nostalgia with memory, wistfulness as well, the idea of the past being preserved or lost, depending on whether people are able to preserve it or want to preserve it or not. We're thinking about these ideas of history as layered, right? There are different time periods we can engage with, as well as different perspectives. So for my people who were in the Handmaid's Tale class, thinking about history and the gymnasium as a palimpsest, which is a kind of ancient document that has writing on it and is scrubbed out and then written on again in a different way. So you can see the different layers of writing. Dahiri, you remember? Excellent. We can also, so we can think of repurposing the past or rewriting history. And that links us to ideas of the past or history versus memory. And if there is a difference, because it certainly seems there is, isn't there, with ideas of myth making, ideas of the winners writing the history or history written by the living. About memory being different, what being preserved, what being lost here. We can also think about history as a tension between past and present as well, or a kind of narrative between the past and present, a story, in other words. And thinking as well with history about personal versus public or cultural history or social history. We can think about how things have changed or shifted. And we can think about the liminal spaces between history as well. Hello, VFX. Thank you for joining us. We can think about the liminal spaces, which is the space between spaces and the transition between past and present here as well. The passage of time, certainly time has quite a lot to do with history as well, and the passage of time. As well. We've got a lot to talk about with history, right? And let's think about the poem. Oh, fantastic, VFX. Then this will be appropriate for unseen poetry for you as well. You might want to skip the first part about A level and just jump straight in with us to practice. Okay? Okay, so then let's think about the analysis here of the poem. So what I'm going to do is read out the poem to you, and anything that stands out to you in the chat, feel free to, or in the poem, feel free to pop it into the chat. Okay, this includes anything that stands out to you if you want clarification about something, if something stands out but you don't know why, if there's a device that you notice there, whatever stands out to you, anything that you think, okay, we probably want to talk about this for talking about this poem, okay? So again, I'm going to read, you pop your ideas into the chat as we go, okay? So the poem is called Stamping Grounds Later by Zafar Kunail. Could I behold those hands which span the poles? John Donne, Good Friday, 1613, riding westward. My English grandfather, Stanley, Stan. The first ground I ever held was yours. I can see the earth leave my fist beneath a sleeve of my first school blazer. Further west, 20 years after, the only other handful of earth I've let go was for Mum, who you raised behind the counter of the Polesworth post office on Bridge Street, in that village you'd be buried in. The same village John Donne saddled up in, one Good Friday, riding westwards towards the Welsh marches, where Mum would be buried, in days when messages went on the hoof and by hand. In these unsaddled, unsolid, quickened times, I read the words post office with the post first meaning after, post-millennial, post-dated. In the blank, unsorted space between other thoughts, something has occurred to me. I picture you signing your name on what passes across a small changed counter. Stanley Arthur Everetts. And there it is, writ large in your imagined hand. S.A.E. To you and Mum, it must have been as familiar as old weather in the sky, but those first letters are new ground to me. As I stand on a planet you've both passed from, it's like a present in the post, a coin of earth, held up to this day. So any ideas, pop into the chat as they stand out to you. If you've joined us more recently, the workbook is in the description here, and you'll be able to then write up as we do the analysis of the poem in order to not make my screen extremely messy and covered in everything. I will be speaking mostly and pointing you towards certain places, but not necessarily writing up everything I'm saying. That's for you to do as you annotate the poem alongside me. Dihiri, S.A.E., the grandfather's initials. So yes, the Stanley Arthur Everetts is his name. S.A.E. is his initials. Interesting point that you're noticing that, right? Anything else in the chat? Feel free to keep going. Ideas. Well, let's get into it then, shall we? Firstly, the title, Stamping Grounds Later. So stamping grounds, when someone says, these are my old stamping grounds, it's a very common expression, particularly linked to where someone used to spend their time, where their neighborhood was, where they lived, where their family is from, where they spent their time. So that's interesting already there. And we're thinking about stamping, that's movement, right? That's continuous movement. And the idea of the effect of stamping is also flattening or making an impression. But then we also have these ideas of grounds. Grounds then as the area that you live in this case, we're going to be talking about Polesworth, but also the ground that we notice in the poem, isn't it? That we're talking about the handful of earth or the first ground I ever heard, or the new ground in the last stanza, is him holding a piece of earth likely to put on his grandfather's grave when he's buried. Either that or the ground, the ashes that they scatter. It's up to you. It's not actually clear which. And then this introduces us to these ideas immediately of life and death here at the beginning of the poem, of history as where someone spent their time, of location, but also even more subtly, stamp. A post office is where you buy stamps. And if we're talking about someone who was in charge of the post office in Polesworth, then we're thinking of someone who is both selling stamps but also stamping things, like with their initials there. So putting their mark on something, in other words, and that being an indication of their presence or of their communication in this passing back and forth of stamped material here. And so we have this ideas of the post office, the identity of the grandfather, as well as this idea of having made a mark clearly on his grandson. But this ground, again, this idea of death being linked there as well, particularly in that first stanza, as we're going to see in a moment. And then the later, also this idea of reflection. Stamping grounds is not where you went once. It's where the phrase comes from, where you have been for so long that you've stamped the grass flat. So if you've ever set up a tent, been to a campsite, and you can see where people have had their tents before, for example, or been to a fairground after the fair has left, and you can see where the different rides were set up on the grass because they've been stamped flat, or even on a path that's been stamped flat and doesn't have grass on it standing up anymore. It's to show this movement, this returning, continuous movement. They're speaking about location and presence here, and returns too. That also speaks to this idea of the parentheses of later, of coming back to something again, return to these same ideas. Then let's consider the epigraph. An epigraph is kind of the subtitle of the poem. It's an introduction to the poem by someone else, usually. And this epigraph is from John Donne. And you may, if you were in an exam, panic because you might think, oh, I have heard of that poet, but I don't know anything about them. That's okay. It's common that you'll have a poem with an epigraph of someone else for an unseen poem, but we can see what we can work with because an epigraph is included in order to introduce an initial idea here. And we can work out quite a lot based on the information we're given. It says, could I behold those hands which span the poles? It's John Donne, Good Friday, 1613, riding westwards. Okay, well, this gives us an idea already. John Donne, this was written in 1613 because that's part of the poem of Good Friday. That's the date of the poem. Good Friday, 1613, riding westward. So again, we have ideas of movement here. And we have an idea of when this was written. So again, thinking about history here. And if we think about what Good Friday is, Good Friday to Christians is when Jesus died. Jesus was crucified. So again, thinking about death and movement and history here. And we can, sure, think about the fact that in the 1600s, there was particularly more common to have poems about religion and devotion. Certainly, the Elizabethan sonnet is called that for a reason. We can also think about what the epigraph actually says. Could I behold those hands which span the poles? Could I look at those hands that span the poles of the earth? But also, if we're talking about Jesus and his death on the cross, perhaps it's the poles of the cross as well. So Jesus's crucified form with arms extended, actually reaching out in John Donne's description, thinking about them as reaching out to cover the whole globe. So there again, with this poles, we have ideas of direction, like with westward, the pole, north and south pole, right? This idea of reaching and extension, power there. And spirituality. But also this could I behold. We're not talking just about Jesus. We're also talking about the personal connection here. Saying, could I look at Jesus's hands spanning the pole here and understand them, perhaps appreciate them? Could I look at them? Remember, this person is meant that Jesus died for the sins of others, of the world. So thinking about perhaps reflection here of one's own experience and thinking about the sacrifice of someone else or the importance of someone else, and this idea of fervent devotion perhaps. So already we've got quite a lot of ideas about history. If we know a bit more about John Donne, we can say, well, he's part of the English literary tradition, right? He's an important poet from history. So even there, in having an epigraph from John Donne, we're linking to the English literary tradition. And thus making a connection between personal history and cultural history immediately. So we've got tension between two different kinds of history already at play. We haven't even got into the poem yet. So showing how much you can do with just a little bit. And let's take a look at this first couple of lines. My English grandfather, Stanley, Stan. Notice in the second line, the first ground I ever held was yours. So then this first line is actually a form of direct address, isn't it? Direct address. As we're speaking to the person here, to his grandfather. English is interesting as well because it suggests perhaps a mixed heritage of different cultures, but a connection to this English history, again, that is also in line with John Donne. Grandfather, Stanley, Stan. And there we have this shortening through the caesura and the end stops as well of going from my English grandfather, this big idea, to Stan shortly is like a kind of reframing, isn't it? And the shorter, the colloquial, Stanley is a pretty common name, and then shortening it to Stan shows an intimacy as they seem to be getting closer and closer in space. It's almost like he's renaming him to try and get him more approachable, right? So trying to locate him and establish or remember or link to this personal connection here as well. The first ground I ever held was yours. So there, this ground, then immediately we think is earth, right? Is ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We're thinking about death here. The first ground I ever held was yours. So again, now we're thinking about the closeness and the intimacy of actually perhaps looking at someone's ashes or holding someone's ashes, and what a profound experience that would be there. We've been located already within the literary tradition, but we're now thinking of this start to the poem as being very personal as well. The first ground I ever held. Ground, the connotations of solidity, of foundation, of support. there, but the speaker, is holding it, this idea of holding with connection, with cherishing, perhaps with intimacy, with closeness here as well, with memory as well. And then as we move in, I can see the earth leave my fist beneath a sleeve of my first school blazer. So they're really vibrant visual imagery that shows this really personal connection and perhaps then indicates how important this memory is. That, like with our own personal memories, when we can remember them really clearly, it's probably because it's an important or a significant memory to us. He can see the earth leaving his fist. We can see that too through that visual imagery and the detail of his cuff, not only linking him again to memory, but also to perhaps childhood, first school blazer, usually year 7, right? So young teenager, and thinking about the earth leaving his fist, then early loss, right? A childhood memory of loss there. And it seems like a very personal connection. Also, interestingly, linked with English values again of uniform, blazers. That's particularly English school uniform, isn't it, as well? And this fist, interestingly as well, introduces this idea of hands again, alongside the held in the previous line, which was initially established in the epigraph of hands. And now we're thinking of Jesus's hands firstly, and then of holding and a fist here. So like holding on to here and watching this slip away as the earth falls out of their fist. But this idea of unwillingness to let go, perhaps linking again to the title of the poem, Stamping Grounds, a return then again to this memory over and over again because they don't want to let go. The notice as well, there is caesura as well as enjambment here. Beneath the sleeve of my first school blazer, we do have a kind of movement across those two lines there, where we're almost watching the journey of the earth falling, right? Leave my fist. We can see that first little bit of a drop. Beneath the sleeve, we're literally tracing that movement there of my first school blazer. And then again, another caesura. It's that idea of finality or a shift, because then we do shift further west. So a literal jump in time as well as perspective. 20 years after, so again, reaching out again. The only other handful of earth I've let go, again, this idea of letting go, handful of earth, was for Mum, who you raised behind the counter. So this then idea of a handful of earth here. Again, an important person here. This idea of being separated here from the two, or having to let go. These two distinct memories as well, but related in this feelings of loss and sadness and grief. And this idea of having to let go, this idea of release or acceptance there as well. And interestingly as well, that idea of further west and distance and time, initiated in the epigraph, but thinking then about west, we're moving west. What else moves west towards a day? Well, the sun, right? The actual sun in the sky. The sun moves from east to west. So if we are moving westward, like John Donne as well, we're moving on through time. We're moving through life. We have the grandfather's death, and then later on in life, 20 years later, we have the mother's death, and we're still moving westward. Rolling chair for effect there. And so we're thinking then about this idea of time passing, the movement of the sun during the day and moving on whether you want to or not. Now, if you know a little bit more about John Donne, there are these ideas in the poem that's being referenced, the Good Friday poem, of light and east and Christ being linked, or Jesus being linked, with darkness, sin, and the speaker being linked. And this idea of John Donne's speaker wanting to move east, but is being continuously pushed west. So this idea of wanting to return in that poem that also seems resonant in this poem, doesn't it? If you don't know about John Donne, that's absolutely fine, because you may still notice that west and that passage of time linked to the movement west there, which suggests still this idea of change and time and passage of time, but also this idea of resistance to it with that fist and that letting go, feeling like not wanting to. And the idea of these being related with the whom you raised behind the counter stanza enjambment there. Do you notice that whole stanza enjambment? And this introduces a key idea of the counter here. What is a counter in a post office, for example? A counter is the tabletop, the surface that separates the people who are working there from the customers there, right? And they are passing things back and forward. In a post office, particularly, they're passing letters, parcels, presents, packages, information, postcards, right? They're passing that back and forward. So then that means they are handing back and forward communication and connection. And this idea of raising behind the counter. So thus, the grandfather being linked to the mother, his responsibility, he raised her behind the counter. So raised her perhaps with the same values, raised her in the same place. But also with counting, we're also thinking of measuring, right? A counter is a tabletop, a surface, work surface, but it's also resonant of those ideas of measuring and counting, perhaps counting time, perhaps counting connections, perhaps counting as in mattering, right? Like being important as well. So raised behind the counter of the Polesworth post office on Bridge Street. There's an extra long pause there, but also a reaching out, because the sentence doesn't finish with counter. It finishes with buried in 2 lines later. So that's very indicative then of this reaching out. We've had a lot of reaching out so far in the epigraph, and then the handful of earth holding the sleeve of the blazer, the letting go of the handful of earth. We have this continual reaching motion here that is replicated in the structure of the poem as well. And interestingly, then we get into some quite quotidian language. If that's not a word you recognize, I will write it up. I find it a very useful one because it just means daily, normal, typical. Quotidian details or quotidian language of talking about the Polesworth post office, Bridge Street, right? That gives us a real sense of place here, in that there's a specific place where he was that is associated with the grandfather. The counter, the Polesworth post office on Bridge Street. Of course, it's not Lake Street, it's not Main Street, it's Bridge Street here. So again, a sense of connection with a bridge, perhaps the bridge between past and present. The bridge like a counter, similar shape, right, of passing things over it. Ways of communication and extension. And then Polesworth post office. Could we hear an echo of this here? Absolutely. If you think that is a stretch, that's fine. With poetry, it is very difficult to overstretch oneself because all of these choices are so clearly intentional. This idea of the Polesworth post office. on Bridge Street. We have that p there as well that speaks to this perhaps official nature of the busyness of this place, of the movement of it, of the physicality of the grandfather's memory here being so linked to the counter there. And in that village, you'd be buried in. So this idea of the importance of place again. Location is their life. Their village is part of their identity. For the grandfather, this is their connection, their power. Clearly, the post office is an important place in a village because it ensures connection, communication with the rest of the world. And it also, though, of course, that village is also linked to his death, the village you'd be buried in. You didn't say the village you lived in, but that you be buried in. So this idea of life and death in the same place, time passing in this place and people changing, moving west, in other words, metaphorically. But also with John Donne, we're linking back because he's talking about Jesus's death and we're talking about the grandfather's death. So perhaps we're then thinking, not in a blasphemous way by any means, but in a way of reflecting on the power or reach or importance of different figures, of Jesus in one instance and of the grandfather in another. These ideas of connection, hands, and death, or links between the two. And again, be buried in, full stop. Again, so that idea of the permanence of the death there as the end of that life. But then, enjambment again, that same village John Donne saddled up in one Good Friday, riding westwards towards the Welsh marches. So then, sure, the end of one personal life, but this connection with the life of the town. Polesworth is also the place where John Donne started this ride. So then thinking about the intersection of personal and public history through the setting here. Through the setting here. And of course, this gives us the closer connection to the epigraph itself. One Good Friday, again, death, biblical allusion there, or religious imagery, whichever you like. This idea of saddled up in, again, journeys here. Saddled up in, riding westwards. Notice the soft consonants of the W's there. Riding westwards. We really hear that westwards towards the Welsh marches. The same with the further west 20 years after the death of the mother, who clearly died closer to Wales, if that's also west, where mum would be buried. We can hear that w, w, w. Perhaps there, in that soft consonants, hearing this kind of continuity or this movement here, or this resonance of place as like echoing with the past, right? And it continues on across the stanza. Where mum would be buried. So there we then have a journey from one buried to another buried, just like we have this earth being linked with this earth here. We have this journey of life of 20 years of movement towards the west in our lifetime. And towards the Welsh marshes, this kind of emptier, freer, wilder place there. That's very different from a post office, right? So this idea of change there, and perhaps then this return to the post office is this kind of nostalgia, this wanting to return to a different kind of life or history. And then the dash, the Welsh marshes, where mum would be buried. Again, those M dashes, which are the longer dashes, seem almost parenthetical, don't they? The Welsh Marches, then associating that with the mum there as well. The start and the end of the journey of John Donne seem to be where the grandfather was buried and then where the mum is buried. This idea of connection and resonance of this journey here. The dashes, again, that interleaving, so that tying in of or return of that memory of the mum. We're talking about the grandfather, but it also brings up related memories of the mum, and thus we're thinking about this history all as interlinked and mixed with John Donne and with a broader history of a place. In the days when messages went on the hoof and by hand. So this idea of messages went more organically, more naturally. Tahiri afterwards, 20 years after, further west 20 years after was for mum. On the hoof, so more naturally, on foot, or obviously on horses' hooves, if we're talking about John Donne, saddling up, and by hand. This idea of the interchange between people, of passing a message on with that physicality and contact of handing a letter to someone rather than emailing them, right? Connection. And then again, notice the H's, the on the hoof and by hand. We can hear that physicality there, that soft connection. It almost sounds real, doesn't it? The contact between them. Again, notice at the end of that stanza, a full stop. It's like we've concluded that idea there. And it does seem so, because in the next part, it does seem like there is a shift. In these, so all of a sudden, we're not talking about was, memories of over 20 years ago, etc. But later, in these unsaddled, unsolid, quickened times. Okay, shift, definitely. We're now talking about a shift to present tense. That's now talking about the present and the tension between the past and the present, right? In these unsaddled, unsolid, quickened times. Okay, quickened, condensed, right? Unsolid, loose, unsaddled. A saddle allows you to ride a horse, right? The unsaddled, then again, looser, less controlled, perhaps, less regulated. It gets the impression that these times are not so good, right? That this is a feeling of a lost direction or lost substance or lost meaning here, that we have lost this physical connection. We can certainly feel that way if we think about how many post offices have closed in the last 20 years with the advent of the internet, right? Whereas previously, the post office was a hub here. The grandfather was an important person. Now, we don't have this sense of direction. We don't have this sense of permanence or connection here. And it seems like the reader or the speaker is struggling with this. I read the words post office with the post first meaning after. So this then is suggesting, especially these capital letters, we're really thinking about these words. Post office. Post office is a place where mail is sent, right? Where letters and postage is sent, things that are posted. But now he's saying the meaning has shifted through that word post, which he now reads in his mind as after. Rather than post as being linked to the mail, post is now being linked to after something. So it's almost as if he's thinking of this kind of bifurcation which is a split in two between past and present. And we're now in the after or post time. So perhaps post his grandfather's death, post his mother's death. And this changing feels like a kind of dislocation and uncertainty, right? It feels like he's almost rewriting his memories of post office. He's now thinking about it in a different way. And so this idea of changed meaning with the changed time. And interestingly, this continues. The semicolon there is a literal interruption to the line again. Again, a bifurcation or a split, as if we're now in the after time. We can't go back to that previous time. Post-millennial, post-dated, and then the ellipses there. So this language is then very, very modern, right? Post-millennial is quite pop culture language here. Post-dated, interestingly, is when something is dated after the fact, particularly linked to mail. That is post-dated means the process of sending it is tracking the time it is late or it's behind, or it's marked with a certain date. So then we're thinking of this idea as separation, as dislocation, as after not the mail, and that something has been lost here, that some meaning has been lost, and we've split off from this previous time to a different time now. In the blank, unsorted space between other thoughts, something has occurred to me. Okay, so again, it feels like something is been lost. We are in this kind of liminal space between thoughts or between time periods. And we're trying to negotiate where we are. We've lost something and time has moved on, but we're not really sure what to do with this difference and this blur between past and present, between a post office that now has a different meaning and a different significance in society. So this is talking then more broadly about society. Now, thinking about blank. So perhaps rather than all of this writing, this handwriting, we have blank screens, for example. So speaking to an emptiness, the unsorted, sorting, everything is important in a post office, but now we have this idea of everything being kind of mixed together, confused. Again, we feel uncertain, we feel dislocated here as well. And it feels like the speaker is trying to find themselves in this place. That something has occurred to me again, that vague language there, that uncertain tone that's being developed. There's an uncertainty here about what has happened, and that use of construction of the line, something has occurred to me. The me is the receiver here, the me is passive here in that construction, which suggests that they are not this kind of powerful person that the grandfather was, who is linked much more to activity and movement and that counter. Here we have more blankness. Something has occurred to me. And then we have this really interesting white space here, not a typo, but intentional white space, where we have this pause here in the middle of a line. This also counts as white space, or a structural idea. You could even call it some kind of caesura, as long as you explain that it's white space here that you're talking about. This I picture you. We're literally in the line creating distance, creating a break between the present, and the past. It's almost as if in that white space, we're kind of diving back into a past, don't we? This separation between this post-millennial world and then returning to the grandfather again. I picture you. But it's also a little bit like a memory dive or myth making again, because it's I picture you. It's not I remember you. It's more this idea of creation here, of imagine memories, perhaps because clearly he did idealize the grandfather. And interesting that we had so much physicality before with the hands. And we return to it now with this I picture you extension again across. He is missing it, absolutely, Dihiri. I picture you across. We're reaching out towards that picture of them, signing your name on what passes across a small changed counter. Again, I picture you there, that putting on that projection of what he is trying to imagine, signing your name. In other words, leaving your mark, juxtaposed here with these blank, unsorted spaces, these unsolid times, are juxtaposed here with signing your name. That's such a clear, solid, permanent mark there. Signing your name on what passes. Again, that idea of movement back and forth, exchange back and forth, the counter being this reach, exchange, communications back and forth that is kind of mimicking that back and forth of the stamping grounds again, right? You're returning to the same place, going to your happy place in a way, right? Of signing your name. He's imagining his grandfather signing his name on things and exchanging them, signing. That idea of post-dated again. And then across the small, changed counter. Again, we're literally, through the structure of the poem, reaching across that counter, aren't we? We can see the movement there of our eyes and our breath. And then again, counter. We've returned to this image of the counter again after 2 stanzas where we've moved away from it through death, through time passing, and then we return back to it there. And this white space here really allows us to reach across it here. And then we get the grandfather's name, finally. Stanley Arthur Everett. We return back to him, and in a very clear way. Full name here. So it's almost like he's summoning him, right? And he seems like this kind of larger than life figure here with that full name, this kind of memory and projection there, noticing of this identity, this person. And again, notice the M dashes there, making this stand out on the line through that caesura as important. So saying this name is important. This is what brings us back to reality, to solidity, to certainty, to the realness of this past compared to this blank, unsorted space. And there it is, writ large. So we have again that sort of gentle caesura and enjambment as we seem to return back to memory again, right? Like we were in the first stanza. Not harsh like the big semicolon in the third stanza, but more gentle there as we kind of lull back into these memories. Writ large, written big, important in your imagined hand. Ooh, there we're thinking in that imagined hand that the speaker is imagining what their grandfather's handwriting looks like. He doesn't know himself, which again suggests this distance of 20 plus years of distance between when he last saw his handwriting, if he did, and now. And so trying to imagine this hand does create that idea of criticality there, of projected memories and tension between what's real and what's idealized, what's memory and what's history here as well. And this SAE there with the white space, again, we're conjuring this image here. Hi, Rhea. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Mavis. It's been so lovely to have you. Welcome, Rhea. Thank you for joining us. We're just getting to our last stanza of our poem now. And so there, that SAE. Now, there are some suggestions as to what this could be. Thinking about standard address envelope, etc. There are some postal words associated with these letters. But regardless of what we know about the post office, these letters stand out as important here, right? The power of this person and this name here as linked to perhaps even this handful of earth, right? As we've got this imagined hand, it's like we've managed to bring something of him back here with this handwriting. And then to you and Mum, it must have been as familiar as old weather in the sky. But those first letters are new ground to me. Here again, we've got a lot of wordplay going on as we think about to you and Mum. So to the grandfather and to his daughter, the speaker's mother, they would find his handwriting almost unnoticed, right? So recognizable, so familiar as old weather in the sky. Interesting phrasing that there as well, because perhaps that their idea is something that is changeable, weather, but something that in the older times, people were more accustomed to being able to read the signs of weather. Now everyone is just looking at their app and not even looking at the sky to see what the weather is like outside. But at the time, it's this idea of old weather in the sky being more dependable, expected, readable, and sort of omnipresent there. But those first letters are new ground to me. Okay, then thinking about those first letters as in the letters of his name, there's imagined handwriting, but also those first letters then linking with the written word, right? With printed material, with the letters of a post office, right? That are wanting to put a hand on and thinking about handwriting as linked very much to closeness and intimacy and to the experience that the speaker already has here. These first letters are new ground to me. Well, what's the old ground? The first ground was the ground of the grandfather, throwing it on the coffin. And the second is from the mum. Then we're talking about the village of being buried in. So we're thinking about the earth of being buried in there and the place of riding, again, burial there again. And then we have this unsaddled, unsolid times. And now we're returning to new ground. We're returning to freshness and fertility, foundation, definiteness, solidness. And if we think about the title, we're returning again to those stamped grounds. Stamped grounds for the grandfather and the mother are not stamped grounds for the speaker, it seems. He's returning to this place that was very familiar to the grandfather, but is new to him. So then this journey returned to again and again. This poem then also, if we're thinking about these first letters, perhaps the first letters of the poem, thinking about the poem then becoming solid because we're writing it, he's writing it to the grandfather. We're thinking about the letters of this poem also becoming a form of written communication, becoming solid and permanent, in contrast to those blank, unsorted spaces, those unsolid, quickened times. that space between other thoughts, we now have something solid again. And with that to me, full stop, creates, it feels like a sense of confidence there, or firmness or certainty again for the first time after that lack of solidity in the third stanza. And then as I stand, enjambment there, as I stand, that moment of pause there, as I stand, new ground. We're thinking again about certainty, solidity, connection, this journey, even again, as I stand on a planet you've both passed from. So permanence of me being here, but the impermanence of life on this planet because other people have left it. And the separation between them. He is standing here in the post office. They are in the next world, or whatever it is he believes, the planet you've passed from. It's like a present in the post. So imagining the handwriting of his grandfather here is like a present in the post. Well, of course, the post, it's like a parcel he's received from the post office. It's a connection between the grandfather who is dead and the grandson, the speaker, who now feels closer and more connected to them. A present, but also, of course, he didn't say gift, he said present, as in past and present. This bifurcation now seems to have been somewhat resolved through this sense of connection here. As I stand on a planet you've both passed from, again, notice it's like a present in the post. We've got that of the Polesworth post office again. It's like that little echo of the past that's continued as we keep going. And the connection, a coin of earth held up to this day. So a coin of earth held up, a piece of earth, in other words. So thus, that this handful of earth from the first stanza becomes a coin of earth. Why not return to a handful of earth? Well, perhaps it's these ideas of value, preciousness, preservation, almost like an ancient coin that people often discover from ancient Rome, for example, that's been discovered. These ancient coins, something from a different time. These letters that holding as a piece of earth, a piece of connection to both the place and the person that has value and importance here. It feels like they have new connections to these old ideas here. And that this coin held up to this day, there's something solid and holdable here that can go with him into this day. And notice where we end. We end on this day. We don't return to the past. We're in the present. So we have gone back in this memory, and now we've returned at the end, carrying a piece of the past with us in the present. Of course, we've also got structural elements. We've got here 4 sestets, which is 6-line stanzas. This is continuous across the poem, perhaps very much like this continuous, consistent movement across, as if they are also moving westward as we keep going through this poem. There's an idea of control and movement as we keep going, with moments of dislocation, but that does seem to suggest this idea of continuity, of going westwards, even though we look back eastwards, but also of this connection, the poem being a liminal space even between the past and the present, between the memory and the present day, the time of writing, and this journey between them, and that this controlled sense of structure seems to create these connections that link past and present without disruption. They are continuously sort of sewn together here and finalized in that coin of earth at the end. Anyone thoughts? People have been quiet for a minute. What do you reckon? Any reactions? Any surprises? How do we feel about the poem? What are our responses here? Things that you expected? Surprising? Unexpected? A lot to talk about, right? Absolutely. So let's think now about some ideas. So we've done all of this analysis. Of course, this is way more analysis than what you would do for an exam, because we've spent 40 minutes talking about the exam, talking about the poem without writing anything up yet. But let's think about how we organize our ideas. And this is the way that I like to do it, is by organizing into different ideas about how history is presented. And I find that it is most helpful to do this in terms of the order of the poem as you go, because if not, it becomes quite bitty and means that you're jumping back and forth and perhaps not recognizing that some things are foreshadowed here and later developed and later concluded or subverted, right? So we do kind of need to do things in order. So what first big idea about history do we have here? We, for example, have the idea of history here as being linked to personal connection. Feel free to put your ideas in the chat as well. And how do we do this? Well, through the personal story here. We can start on this with this idea of stamping grounds as where the place is that is bringing all of these memories back, and talking about these personal ideas here of the grandfather, these memories of the grandfather in particular. And we can include ideas about John Donne with that as well to give us this idea of what the grandfather is like, who the grandfather is, why we're talking about this personal history of particularly loss. Then the second idea, we sort of shift here, talking then about the counter and the village here, and this journey between them, talking about John Donne and this movement westwards. So there we have this idea of the focus on the image of the counter. Prince, by all means, go ahead. Rhea, absolutely. Everyone's so locked in and focused. Counter and its historical significance, or perhaps of the village. And so these ideas then of connection to historical significance and to the counter there as well. It's also helpful to think about structure. Structure is often a place where you can do a little counter argument or reinforce your previous points. It's likely for an unseen poem that's on its own, you'll be able to talk about 4 big ideas. For a comparative, it's likely you can do more like 3 because you're talking about 2 poems. So you can do 3 ideas and condense these ideas into. So talking then about the structure as indicative of these ideas. Or you can talk about the shift to present times with the uncertain after date, post-millennial, post-dated, blank, unsorted space. And then finally, we've always got to talk about the conclusion, even if that's only the last couple of lines or the last line or the last stanza. Conclusion as resolved in its tension between the past and the present, right? And this idea of carrying on through. Yeah, Prince, waiting for your question. If you do have one, feel free. a tricky question to answer now, Prince, just because we're in the middle of analysis. But if I have time at the end, I will try and cover it for us. Okay, so these are just some ideas here. So thinking in this third big idea, perhaps about this change, or perhaps more broadly about the structure here across of this continuity, this movement westwards. And then the conclusion at the end, this connection, perhaps even starting more up here with that I picture you, the changed counter there, foregrounding that change, talking about the coin of earth at the end. So when you're practicing your analysis there, your page is going to look like this at a certain point, right? And in order to stop yourself from just attacking these all at random and talking generally and keep coming back and forth to the same point and thus perhaps losing some of your control of your argument, it's helpful to think about these big ideas in a kind of format that allows you to tackle them more easily. Okay, so firstly, the way that the theme of history is foregrounded here. So this is talking about how history is presented at the beginning. Then thinking about history is presented through a certain image, a certain idea, a certain setting, a certain particularly important device in that second idea. These are organizing themselves into paragraphs, of course, right? This is paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and paragraph 4. And then thinking about the structure or any shift in that third idea, and then the conclusion at the end. But not just talking about the conclusion and saying the conclusion is this, but showing that in the conclusion of the poem, history is shown to what? To be accepted as the speaker continues through their current life. The structure is used to engage through history by showing the continuity of life despite these attempts to return back, but the gentle memories that keep returning back and allowing us to separate from these difficult present times. History is presented through the image perhaps of the counter, as I said, this connection in this place and space very much associated with a person, or with layers of history with John Donne. And at the beginning, of course, the grandfather, the handful of earth, etc. So we're talking about history there as personal connection, right? And you want to think with this, as you organize yourself, what would we have to include in a discussion of this poem? Put into the chat, what would you have to talk about? In my mind, you'd have to talk about the handful of earth. You'd have to talk about the first line with this, my English grandfather, Stanley, Stan. You'd have to talk about the epigraph. You'd want to talk about the distance between the two in terms of time. You'd want to talk about you'd want to talk about the colloquial language that shows that intimate connection. You'd want to talk about the visual imagery of the sleeve and the handful of earth there. Then we can move on from all of those ideas and cover all of that in that one paragraph. And then later talk about different ideas. So talk about, as we said, the counter. Oh, apologies. The counter here, the description of Bridge Street and Polesworth, perhaps even with that resonance established in the epigraph. We can't talk about that unless we've talked about the epigraph already, right? The different kinds of history of the same place with the interlaying of John Donne and the family history there. The journey as a passage, the continued motif of the hands passing through there, and the movement of the journeys. Then in the paragraph, perhaps on the shift or perhaps on the structure, we can talk about the stanza enjambment with the counter, if we haven't covered that already. We can talk about the free verse. We can talk about the white space in the poem. We can talk about the as I stand and the enjambment there. There's loads we can talk about. The free verse, as I said, the sestets, the regular sort of colloquial rhythm of the poem, the lack of rhyme. There's a lot to talk about. If we wanted to talk about the shift instead, we could talk about the blank, unsorted space, the unsaddled, unsolid, quickened times, the juxtaposition of the previous with the post there, and the intransient versus the transience of solidity and impermanence. And then in the conclusion, we can talk about the SAE, the coin of earth, the ending on day with the final line, the tone of acceptance, the significance of the first letters, with postage, talking to the speaker, the soft P consonants there, the connotations of counter, mattering, resonance, legacy, etc. So this is how we organize ourselves. What do we have to talk about? What would an examiner be cross with us if we didn't mention? We're covered quite a lot here. And then how does this presentation link to modern life? Well, this idea of personal connection, linked to personal grief and human experiences of loss, thinking about the image of the counter as a kind of past life being linked with the interlaying of space and history here, the tension between past and present in that third stanza perhaps. And in the end, that idea of acceptance, giving a message of hope perhaps for a grieving audience, up to you, but thinking about how we can project those ideas. So here is what I came up with. The idea 1, the theme of history is foregrounded through personal connection. Idea 2, history as presented through the image of the post office in Polesworth is used to engage with both the personal and cultural memory. Idea 3, the poet uses the structure of the poem to engage with the theme of history through a consistent and continuous structure that mirrors the speaker's movement through time and space from his familiar stamping grounds. We can even use that then to talk about that lack of solidity in the third stanza. And then in the fourth idea, the conclusion of the poem, history is shown to continue through the imagination of the living. So there we've got our ideas. And let's take a look at how we can write them up, shall we? Very similar to people who've seen it, to our essay structure for drama and for prose, likely because most of unseen poetry is comparative, that you will have time for 4 or even 3 if it's comparative ideas, rather than the 5 of one of your singular studied text like Othello or A Streetcar Named Desire. But push yourself to write for 4 if you can, because that will give you an opportunity to keep writing until the end and will allow you to push yourself in terms of crafting ideas. And let's think again briefly about what we write about here for unseen poetry, because we need to include writer's intention for unseen poetry. How do we do that? Well, we do it by asking, why might this poem exist? And unlike your seen poems and your studied poems, it's not likely that you know the poets you're given. You might know more about John Donne than you know about Zafar Kunail, who is a contemporary poet. which means that we have to be a little bit more creative, but we can still be mindful of writing a good writer's intention. So these are some common ideas to think about how we can tackle writer's intention. So to reflect a contemporary zeitgeist in which to reflect the ideas of today, of a dislocated, uncertain times that us are currently living in. That makes sense if we're thinking about this wanting to return to the past because we don't like the lack of certainty in the present. To question the human condition or to reflect the human condition, you could also do, to think about these experiences that humans have and wonder why they happen. To highlight the importance of, we could say, the importance of personal history, or the importance of connections or setting to a person in terms of their memories, their identity, their culture, their past, their history. We could do to celebrate or to condemn, or something in the between is more neutral, like to discuss. There to think about, are they celebrating something? Are they condemning something? In this poem, not so much of either of these, perhaps celebrating a cherished loved one and attempting to hold on to their memory. Condemn a little bit too strong for this poem, unless we're condemning these blank, unsorted spaces right now. Just demonstrate the strength or weakness of here, thinking about the strength of memory, the weakness of, in this poem that doesn't work so well, but perhaps the strength of memory, the strength of the past, the strength of the grandfather, the strength of human connections, etc. To comment on or justify is particularly neutral. The need for the past, the need for history, the need to return to old stamping grounds. To comment on the implications, the long-term effects of loss, or to question or to express, you can also say, beliefs about the omnipresence of the past, the need to return to the past, the need to reflect on the past to give us hope. And then to reinforce or subvert the view. So to reinforce, to support the view of the past as important, or to subvert the view of, and this would be to challenge the idea. So less challenge in this poem, unless we're thinking again about the modern times, and challenging or subverting these ideas of present as better and more moving, more full, more exciting, when they want to return to the past in a way. So have a think about how you want to do your writer's intention, because having some phrases safeguarded there to practice and to use that give you a way in to write about a writer who you don't know is helpful. This also applies to your thesis statements. So thesis statement will look slightly different from your studied texts. It will likely be shorter as well, because you do not have the same extensive knowledge of the writer's experience and context. How many of you have practiced an Othello thesis statement that included Cinthio and Desdemona and the Moor? We don't have the information about Cuneiel's source material the way we do with Shakespeare's, who we've studied for 2 years at A-level. But we can still make conclusions. A successful thesis statement will still have a clear addressal of the question in the first sentence as quickly as you can. A brief explanation of how this question appears in the poem through an introduction to your lines of argument, your big ideas, in other words, introduce past, present, mixing of the two. There's an optional link to contextual factors that might have influenced the presentation. So for example, if there was a poem about technology, you might reflect these increasingly digital times, something like that, very brief, but that's optional. And then a suggestion of the writer's intention, possibly including their view of society or life. Again, this is a projection based on what you know, or the audience's intended reaction. So what the audience hopes to instill or react. How the writer wants the audience to react. So here's an example. Cuneiel explores the theme of history in stamping grounds later as the speaker reflects on his postman grandfather's life and death in a small village. In this thoughtful and musing poem, Cuneiel comments on familial history, the broader cultural history of their village, as well as the intersection between past, present, and memory. So those are our big ideas then, right? Family history, broader cultural history of village, intersection between. and seems to conclude that history can be continuously engaged with through memories and familiar places. Okay, starting to the writer's intention there, and then continuing here. Perhaps the poet may have imbued their poem, so filled their poem, with the message that history can simultaneously be personal and cultural and can be preserved even in changing times. Does that give us any specific context about Cuniel, where he's from, what he's doing, what his life is like, what he is inspired by? No, but it does give you a clear idea and a clear introduction to what you are going to say about this poem and what perhaps it could mean based on what you know. How do you do this? Well, this is it broken down, sentence starters based on what I just read out to you. So, poet explores the theme in the poem, whatever the poem is, or you can just say in the poem's title, as they explain what the poem is very briefly about. Then, in this, describe the poem, a little bit of extra detail to show that you understand it. The poet comments on the big ideas there, so on past, present, interplay, and seems to conclude that writer's intention. And then this final sentence, again, not totally necessary, but helpful to support a little bit more your writer's intention. Perhaps then the poet may have imbued their poem with the message that bigger message there, something about life and death, humanity, morality, society, beliefs, etc. Again, keeping it a little bit nuanced, a little bit subtle, suggestive in your language, not saying he definitely said this because I know it and he believes this, because you don't know. So make it tentative in your language so that it's clear you're writing in a nuanced way. Now, how do we write this up? How do we write this up? Well, I've given you an example here of a model paragraph where we can see these ideas actually written up. And if you have joined us for our drama exam masterclasses or for our lessons and live streams across the year, this format looks very familiar to you because we've got our idea there at the top. We've got our model paragraph, and in this blue box above me here, we've got what we want to include. And I personally do this, and my students find it easy as well. Really, this is just that plan here that we've already organized with all of our ideas in it. Okay, so we've got our ideas in it. That's really what we're holding up. So if this is your notes to practice this, that is there in front of you. You don't need to write it out again, but just to indicate what it is I'm doing here. Remember, I don't have critics because this is an unseen poem, so I'm just using the devices here, but I'm planning them out so that I can write about them in a pattern and build them together. So I'm going to read this. Anything that stands out to you, put in the chat. Anything you want to borrow, be inspired by, have a question about, also feel free to put in the chat. While I have you here as well, please do feel free to leave us a review on Trustpilot so that we can continue to provide these free streams for you if you found them helpful. And also, if you're looking for more, my YouTube is obviously here linked and accessible to you. And we've also made my resources here for A-level for all the different topics that we offer. So just a plug to show you there that we have got quite a lot of material for you. If you are interested in finding this helpful so far, please feel free to leave us a Trustpilot review so that we can continue providing these services to you, as well as take a look at what else we offer. I'm going to read this. Any ideas in the chat? The theme of history is foregrounded through personal connection as Cuniel reflects on the memories of a family loss. These ideas of history as linked to death and loss are foregrounded through the title Stamping Grounds later. The title immediately suggests return and reflection, as Stamping Grounds suggests both one's home and routine. It also suggests a deeply personal connection to a particular place, as well as a comfort and familiarity with it, as well as the physical and figurative impact that the speaker's footsteps and presence makes on this place. Thus, ideas of home, individuality, and identity are immediately foregrounded as the audience expects a personal reflection by the speaker on their home or origins, in this case, especially as linked to their grandfather. The addition of the parenthetical later suggests a further distance and passage of time, as though these stamping grounds, whether physical or mental, are well trodden and continuously a point of return for the speaker. The epigraph from John Donne's Good Friday, 1613, Riding Westward, again introduces the ideas of personal reflection as Donne's speaker asks, "Could I behold those hands which span the poles?" In using this epigraph, Cunhill also attached his speaker's personal loss and history to that of the English literary tradition and suggests that personal reflections, like spirituality, can be a deeply spiritual and even transcendental experience, even when experienced in a quotidian setting like Polesworth or when riding westwards. Interestingly, the detailed description of the setting of Polesworth seems to carry a subtle resonance of the poles of Donne's epigraph, thus perhaps suggesting a kind of spirituality connected with the journey of returning home. Donne's speaker, clearly on a journey themselves, appears to contemplate the unfathomable and sublime power of Jesus, whose godly power spans the poles. Taken with the first line of the poem, Cunhill suggests a connection to the influence and power of his idealized grandfather, who through the speaker's admiration and memories appears to have attained an almost divine status. However, this epigraph also subtly introduces the theme of death and loss in the poem, as Donne's poem is titled Good Friday, an allusion to the day that Jesus died on the cross with his arms extended to span the poles. Thus, the audience may expect that Cunhill's poem too is a reflection on the loss of an important and beloved figure. The motif of hands in the poem is also introduced here and developed in the first stanza as the speaker holds the earth that was yours as he buries his grandfather. The importance of the grandfather's influence as the centre of Polesworth life, as its postmaster, is foregrounded from the first line, as Cunhill appears to address the poem to their grandfather in My English Grandfather, Stanley, Stan, and thus foregrounds the personal connection between the speaker and their grandfather as they appear to draw closer to the grandfather through the repeated colloquial referential strategies that suggest a personal rapport and intimacy between the two, perhaps as, like Donne's speaker, Cunhill's speaker attempts to grasp a complex and slightly mythicized figure. This initiates a semantic field of communication and connection later in the poem, centralized in the image of the post office, and perhaps the use of direct address directed towards the grandfather is an attempt to reach out and communicate deep feelings of personal loss and nostalgia for the time spent with a beloved family member. Thus, it appears that the speaker's personal reflections are a way of negotiating both loss and spirituality, as these two figures appear to remain idealized and awe-inspiring to the speaker as the poem continues. The tone of awed intimacy is built as the speaker recalls that the first ground, or death, that they experienced was yours. Cunhill's vibrant visual imagery captures the moment in which the speaker watches the earth leave my fist beneath a sleeve of my first school blazer. Here, his handful of earth becomes a personal attempt to reach and understand this lost but beloved figure. Perhaps then the enjambment across the first stanza then suggests this attempt to reach out to connect with the grandfather, even after he has let go of his grandfather's physical presence. The focus on hands here again are reinforced by the continuous but gentle use of enjambment and caesura in the first stanza, which perhaps serve to establish memories as vibrant but piecemeal as a result of the passage of 20 years or more. The subtle but continued references to the west and westward movement create a sense of continuous movement throughout the poem, as if the speaker is attempting to return to the east, to the beginning of his life, and is resistant in the inevitable movement westwards, away from his grandfather and the past. Perhaps this speaks to his complicated feelings towards the loss of his grandfather, as Cunil appears to suggest that history can be deeply felt and experienced, especially through personal connections. A contemporary audience may view this as a raw and personal reflection on grief and how it tends to idealize beloved figures and places after death. Hello, Muzz. Hello, Ilem. Thank you for joining us. Oh, it's Aya. Oh, hey, hello. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, so with this paragraph, we can see that these pieces of evidence, these ideas are addressed, but drawn together and continuously linked back to show that this is all a pattern about personal connection. That all of these different ideas about John Donne, the first line, the visual imagery is all about the personal connection to grief here. And we can do this for our other big ideas or our other paragraphs as well. And I've made some sentence starters here specifically to talk about poetry, so that we can think about how we can talk about the image or a central image of a poem. And we could include ideas like the focus on the repeated image of the counter as a symbol of connection, distance, and exchange, detailed description of the setting of Bridge Street and Polesworth, a link developed between the grandfather and John Donne in location, further resonance of different kinds of history in the same place, journey as a passage through time and life, the village being linked to identity for the grandfather and John Donne, the continued motif of hands across the poem, gently juxtaposing images of continuity, the same village and movement, saddled up, riding westwards, went on the hoof, and the soft consonants of H in, on the hoof, and by hand, creating a sense of continuity and movement and tactility. So sentence starters here for you and evidence for how we can write this up. Let's take a look at another one as well, because I'm conscious that I have said another couple of ideas I want to speak to you about before we get to the end of our 3-hour stream all the way through. So as we said, this third paragraph, we can talk about the caesura in the first line, stanza enjambment, linked specifically to the counter. Don't just talk about stanza enjambment generally, but link it to a specific place. The sestet, the regular controlled structure, the free verse, the soft consonants in the third and second and fourth stanzas, creating a sense of comfort, intimacy, physicality, and continuity. The use of enjambment and caesura to create lilting, halting rhythm. The use of em dashes in Coin of Earth. The use of white space in SAE and I Picture You. The use of enjambment in As I Stand. And the use of capital letters to disrupt the flow and highlight the change in meaning. Now, if you don't have time for 4 paragraphs or 4 big ideas, then perhaps you can join this up with the middle here, or if it makes more sense, with the conclusion of the poem, which here, again, sentence starters there for you to talk about what the conclusion looks like. Of course, in your workbook, which is in the description, you will be able to have all of these, and thus you'll be able to use them to your heart's content and walk away with them after the end of this lesson. But here, again, in the conclusion, we'd want to definitely talk about the stanza enjambment that carries on the significance of the changed but remaining counter, the connotations of the counter, the symbolic nature at the end of the poem, more linked to meaning and memory, the spacing of SAE again, if we haven't covered that already, and dislocation, the significance of first letters with ideas of postage, communication, literacy, and physicality, the present in the post, the connection between past and present interplay, the soft P consonants, again, ideas of physicality and continuity, the return to the motif of earth in New Ground and Coin of Earth that suggests a cyclicality of memory and history, a description of Coin of Earth and em dashes used to isolate visually on the line, and the ending on day, so that continued movement towards the present and future, but retaining a piece of the past. So there we are, all ideas there, all how we write it up as well. And then a conclusion. With poetry, I'd really rather you spend your time writing a really full 3rd or 4th paragraph. But if we think about a conclusion, it really only needs to be a couple of sentences. It needs to return to the question, summarize your big ideas. That can be happening in the same sentence. further pushing these ideas to link the poem to their conclusion or final presentation in the poem. So saying by the end of the poem, just like you talk about by the end of the play in A Streetcar Named Desire or Othello, for example. And then again, a suggestion of the writer's intention. And if you can or want to or are able to, different audiences' reactions. So here's an example. In conclusion, history serves as a fundamental theme in Stamping Grounds later, as the speaker continuously returns to memories of the past and carries them with him into the future. By the conclusion of the poem, the speaker appears to feel a sense of acceptance about his grief and appears comforted by the coin of earth he's able to carry with him up to this day. The poem concludes with a hopeful tone that not only provides a sense of resolve to the poem, but also returns the audience to the initial image of a handful of earth. Perhaps here, Cuniel attempts to renegotiate with his own memory and provide a sense of closure to this previously mournful image. Cuniel's audience may view this poem as a reflection on the personal and perhaps even imagined aspects of memory and history, and may find comfort in Cuniel's conclusion that the past, though in some ways buried or post, can still be cherished, remembered, and can even create new ground. Thus, the audience may feel that they too can negotiate their own relationship with the past and present. So not a huge amount that we're saying there. We're just talking about we return to history, past, carried into future. By the end, acceptance, hopeful tone, as we return to the same ideas, writer's intention. That's it. You can even pare it down more than this, but just to show you what can be done, there we are. And the same here for your conclusion broken down so that you can talk about it your own way with some sentence starters here to help you. And feel free to pause the video to get these or to look them up in your workbook, which is available to you in the description. And then a couple of ideas here. Well, firstly, how do we compare a studied poem to an unseen poem? Because it's typical that you might have to do that if you're doing A-level literature. Well, firstly, you'll be given a theme that appears in both poems. So the examiners will have chosen a theme that appears in both, so you will definitely be able to talk about history as, or love as, or memory or time, or family relationships as something at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, perhaps when it shifts from that beginning to another idea, and then how it concludes, and even perhaps how you can do it with structure as well. So you want to consider how both poems engage with this theme in the first few lines or stanzas. So your first big comparative idea. So phrase your thinking as both poets present the theme as what? And then once you've found that link, the difference will be demonstrated through the different approaches to this big idea or to the different writer's intentions. So the comparative topic sentence looks like this. Both poets present history as a personal reaction to a significant event. That's it. That's what they have in common. It's not very much. They're just both reacting personally to history event. However, while Cuniel's speaker reflects on the grief of a familial loss, Burnside's poem serves as a personal reaction to a significant cultural event suggested to be the September 11th terror attacks. So the difference, one is talking about family grief, another one's talking about a reaction to a worldwide event, worldwide recognized event. After writing a topic sentence that links them both together in terms of the theme or the way they're talking about history, then talk about one poem first and spend your time analyzing that poem. Then, after you've treated that poem, transition using a linking phrase to the other poem. Here's an example. Unlike Cuniel's speaker, whose grief links events from his personal life to quotidian settings, the speaker in Burnside's poem takes a broader scope as they link the shocking developments of 9/11 to universal human experiences, perhaps as an attempt to reckon personally with the worldwide grief in response to terrorism. So there again, we're just transitioning from the speaker grief to one kind of setting to the other one, the speaker grief universal human experiences. So just transitioning from one to the other in the middle of a big comparative paragraph. then use these linking phrases, even if they're little ones, while treating the second poem. This will allow you to build your comparison across the paragraph, whilst also demonstrating your understanding of the nuanced differences. So adding those little phrases, similarly, in contrast, unlike, like, build in the showing that you can compare. And for example, Edexcel section 1, you are being assessed on how closely you compare the two. If you're comparing it based on the idea that they both have, rather than just generally comparing the poems, then already you're linking them pretty closely. And then if you continue to link them with these little details, you will link them even closer. So here's an example. In contrast to Cuniel's presentation, whose speaker returns again and again to the handful of earth, Burnside locates his speaker with a natural setting teeming with life. So, okay, one fixates on the image of earth, one keeps returning to different images about life in a natural setting. Easy, but adding that little half sentence in makes that extra link really strong. Then at the end of the paragraph, tie the poems back together by evaluating their writer's intention, okay, or their effect on the audience. And this again shows your craft and construction, your AO1 of an argument, whilst also showing that you are actively and continuously tying these poems together. So here's an example. In engaging more clearly with the personal aspects of grief, Cuniel appears to highlight the intensity of personal grief in writing one's familial history. In contrast, Burnside's poem may serve as more of a cultural marker in attempting to capture an individual reaction to a history and globally influential event, and perhaps attempting to capture an instant in which the world was fundamentally changed. So clearly here, Burnside is a studied poet, whereas Cuniel is our unseen. So we're not saying as much about Cuniel as we are about Burnside, but because we're linking them together and contrasting them, it's still strengthening our analysis of both, because we're showing the differences that are subtle, because they're both personal reaction to significant event, but one is personal aspects of grief and one is cultural marker attempting to capture a response to history event. So we're showing the subtle differences between them, and in tying them closer together, we do that. In picking poems that are too far apart, we can't draw them together at all. We can just say, well, one is talking about apples, one's talking about oranges. Here, we're showing about different kinds of apples and how these different apples are different, metaphorically. And then remember to spend an equal amount of time on each poem. So though you may have more context for your studied poem, and of course you may know it better, you should do if it's a seen poem, a studied poem, make sure you also talk about the unseen poem. Make sure you talk about both. Otherwise you can only access parts of the mark scheme. You can't get up into clear or definitely not compelling, and certainly not critical and evaluative, or more broader than that. So drawing them together thematically, so linking them by theme and using linking phrases will help to build your comparative piece and kind of force you to keep talking about both. Making good choices of links between the two will also help you do that. Okay, so as we're thinking about the last few minutes of our exam masterclass, let's think about where we are right now and what we can do from here to make this session useful for you. Currently, you have a fully annotated poem, organized notes and lines of argument, model paragraphs as examples, and guidance for how to write your own paragraphs using sentence starters and the directions I've given. How can we apply this knowledge? So these are options for you for how to make this session useful for you. Of course, listening to it is useful, but engaging with it is more useful, especially if you have exams coming up. These are ways to help you practice studying for poetry. So you can write out the essay on stamping grounds later to practice writing an essay, or just write a paragraph, or practice a thesis statement. You know what you need to practice most. If spending an hour, 45 minutes writing a paragraph is not time you have right now, spend 15 minutes writing a paragraph. You're not meant to spend more time than that on a paragraph anyway. because that's not the time you have in the exam. So see if you can set a timer for 15 minutes and how far you can get in. You can practice planning skills by making an essay plan following this guidance, following by what we did, and the essay structure for a different unseen poem. The Guardian publishes poems all the time. You can look up unseen poems, A-level literature, and whole anthologies come up. Practice, especially maybe choosing one that you would not like to have for your exam, to see how much you can do with a poem that you don't understand perfectly and haven't studied for 2 years. Because, of course, this guidance, the essay plan, the structure all apply to any poem, seen or unseen. You can also practice generating a comparison. So if you know, for example, if you do edXL, that you are doing an unseen with a studied poem, like for section 1 of your poetry paper, then you can compare your poem, your unseen poem, with one of your studied poems. The same goes for AQA. Here are some guidance for studied poems that often come up in anthologies. Material by Ross Barber or History by John Burnside, which is the one I just showed you how to do a comparison with. So clearly there will be comparisons there for you to do so that you're not trying to compare apples and oranges. There are some ways to try with your poems that you know. You can also apply this structure to the annotation, planning, and writing for a studied poem. So take what we've done today and try and do it with a fresh copy of one of your studied poems that you know you need to revise. And see if you can plan out and draft these ideas of lines of argument, your key images, your thesis statement, your big ideas for this poem. Because even if you don't know the topic and you don't know the unseen poem you're going to compare it to, there are certainly a few big ideas that might apply for quite a lot of themes. And you can practice doing this for different themes for your poems as well, for love, for time passing, for different generations. Those are very common themes to come up. You can also use this essay plan structure to practice developing lines of argument. So with 2 of your studied poems, looking at them and practicing, this is foregrounded with, drawn through these images or these shifts, through the structure, through the conclusion, and practice writing your comparative topic sentences. You can review the poetic devices from the beginning of the lesson as we went through all of them. Make flashcards to review their definitions or effects as well. Look to see and annotate either a new unseen poem or a seen poem and see, do you notice devices that you hadn't before? Can you tell their effect? You can also take a look at a previously written essay and edit it to make it more like the model paragraphs you've seen, or to bring out more nuance in your lines of argument if you're talking too generally or just talking about the poem, or if you look back and you see you actually did write a 5-page, 1-paragraph essay there. Or by adding analysis using the sentence starters, the model paragraphs. Use the sentence starters to see if you can add something about a motif or about an alternative interpretation there. There are sentence starters to guide you towards that. And this is the question that you need to answer for yourself. How will you use what you have learned today? How are you going to apply this knowledge and not just log off of YouTube and forget about it, right? How are you going to apply this? And then finally, here are my top tips for unseen poetry, okay? Start with the title of the poem. What ideas or expectations does this title introduce? Are these expectations met or subverted in the poem? Notice these are all going to be questions that you want to practice asking yourself as you go through a poem. So these are also ways that you can try to practice analyzing a new unseen or seen poem. As you read through the poem for the first time, keep your pen or highlighter at the ready. Mark any lines, words, or choices that stand out to you. They will have stand out to you for a reason. You notice them because the writer wants you to, even if you're not sure why yet. What big ideas are foregrounded at the start of the poem? Do these ideas change or remain consistent across the poem? Consider the structure and organization of the poem. What do you notice about the structure of the poem? Does the structure link to any of the ideas? What might this structure help to highlight? Does the structure change at any point? If so, why might this be? As you move through the poem, Pay attention to the choices or focus of the poem. The poet will be trying to direct your attention to specific ideas or images. If you notice a poetic device in the poem, think, why might that be? What effect does it have on you or your understanding as a reader? Does this pair with any other ideas or devices across the poem? Are there moments of rhyme in the poem? Why might this be? Why these words? What patterns do you notice across the poem? What impression do they give you? Why might they exist? What images or ideas appear in the poem? How are they expressed? Does this expression change at any point? Is there a turn, a twist, or a change of perspective in the poem? How is this achieved? We certainly had it in the poem that we looked at. Why might this be? Take note of punctuation or the lack thereof. This is an indication of breath, pause, reflection, or disruption to the previous idea. What might the poet be trying to express here? Consider, is there a different way to interpret these ideas? Is there any room for a different interpretation of this moment? If so, can we include it and say, alternatively, this may also be? Where are there moments of ambiguity, uncertainty, or vagueness in the poem? Can we dive into this session and offer some ideas rather than avoiding this section? Hint, you're never going to have the right answer because you're not the poet, so it's only dependent on your interpretation, which, if it makes sense, if you prove your point and justify it using evidence, is acceptable. How does the poem conclude? What is its final message? How does this relate to the other sections of the poem? Consider poetic conventions. Is the structure, rhythm, rhyme scheme consistent across the poem, or does it change? Is there a cyclical structure? Are there echoes of a poetic form, like a truncated sonnet, like a dramatic monologue? And remember to keep the speaker and poet distinct. How might the poet's experiences or time period affect their presentation of ideas? So that's a load to think about there. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Prince, for you, there are so many purposes of studying English for A-level: critical thinking, passion about the subject, self-expression, understanding of the world, understanding the human condition, understanding all of the different aspects of humanity, the world, and how people think is all important. Also, A-level English literature and university degree in English is very desirable for consultancy, for business, for law degrees, for any real job that requires higher education, because people learn how to think critically, to write well, and to think well. IGCSE, this is not on topic, but if you have questions and stuff on A-levels, where can you get help? Well, there are my resources pages for all of the A-level topics that we study IGCSE. So all of the different maths, sciences, etc., as well as English, are all there. That link there that says myedspace.co.uk. If you search My Edspace on YouTube as well, it'll come up with all of the different live streams that the different teachers are doing for A-level as well, because we offer quite a few. And you can also ask, as you ask me, those questions to those teachers as well for subject-specific content. And then we also offer live lessons. So there are exam masterclasses and then My Edspace live lessons, where we have our own platform that you can sign up to do your lessons with us on a weekly basis, usually twice a week. And then you have an opportunity to study with us as well. That's our exam masterclasses. There's more information about My Edspace in my description as well. And then please do as well, everyone, if you don't mind, if you could take a moment to leave a Trustpilot review so that I can keep providing these resources for free for you on YouTube, that would be wonderful. I'm glad that was helpful. And then just finally, a reminder, as well as a thank you. So our final exam masterclass will be held here on YouTube at Eleanor Does English on the 29th of May from 3 to 6 p.m. And this will be talking about poetry and comparison. And we're going to be looking at Rossetti, who is perhaps the most common poet that we have across different exam boards. So thank you very much for your attendance, for your focus, for your questions, for your participation across this now 3-hour and 8-minute live stream all the way through. I look very much forward to seeing you at our next session. Please also feel free, we do A-level content across our different texts on my channel. There are playlists for Othello, A Streetcar Named Desire, The Great Gatsby, and The Handmaid's Tale, as well as upcoming there will be poetry, as well as obviously this live stream and our next one as well for exam masterclasses. Thank you everyone for your contributions, and see you next time. Thank you Rhea, Mavis and Zakia for modding today. I really appreciate you as well, and good luck on your exams everyone.